Hi guys, this topic or this video is going to be talking about um, the structural deficit, cyclical deficit, and the balances between those. And that's our learning objective. And before we start, we just do a little bit of recap. We learn about fiscal policy, and it is by government initiative, right? And the government is basically the treasury. Okay, the treasury is part of the government, and they will change fiscal policy through two things, which is through our automatic stabilizer or through discretionary stance. Now, automatic stabilizer is the graph that we draw like an X, and we know that there is a budget surplus here and budget deficit here. And we know that this is the revenue, the tax revenue that government collected, and government paid lesser government paid lesser transfer payment when they are actually in the boom time. So we see this is the real GDP. As real GDP goes increases more, we are collecting more tax, so we have higher tax revenue and we have lower transfer payment, right? And we have here is the amount of our revenue, government revenue, and government expenditure. Right. Now in the middle we have a budget balanced. Right, we have a budget balance. Now keep in mind that this is automatic stabilizer. So basically, because there are progressive tax and the unemployment benefits has some requirement, right? So when we are actually in trough times, naturally there are lesser tax being paid due to lower income, and more people are falling into the lower tier of the progressive tax, right? And as well as there are high unemployment, so government naturally make more transfer payment during the time where it has got lower GDP, which is the green color side here, right? And on the right hand side we have budget surplus, so that's when our government is earning more than the transfer payments. That's because in boom time or in expansionary time we see that the economy is earning more, so people can pay with their higher amount. People can pay higher tax due to their high income, and more people get jobs and everyone gets job, and so we only left structure and frictional unemployed people. So naturally our cyclical unemployment fallen to zero, and therefore our transfer payments has become lesser. Now that's automatic stabilizer. And we have discretionary stance or discretionary policy. Now that again, government will go according to two kind of way, right? Depending on the situation of the economy. Now if the economy is actually in drought time or recession time, now we know that then government will actually take on expansionary policy stance action, right? Stance discretionary stance of expansionary stance. That's when we have actually a deflationary gap in the economy, and government will try to increase the aggregate demand or aggregate expenditure so that it can push the whole expenditure up to the potential or to the full employment side. Now if we're actually in boom time or we're actually closer to boom, right, we then will use contractionary stance, and when we have contractionary stance, it means that we want to try to lower the economic activity so that can pull down back to the full employment at the potential back. Yeah, so we don't want the economy to be too inflated. We also do not want the economy to be too low or to die down. Okay, so that's basically what we have done so far. Now what happened is, because this is fiscal policy, automatic stabilizer as well as discretionary stance, they both are fiscal policy. So what you will be seeing is this part here, right? Now in a sense of budget balance in the sense of a budget balance, we can categorize these two balance of government expenditure and government revenue into two different names. Now, automatic stabilizer, because it basically follows the business cycle, so we call this cyclical balance. And for discretionary stance, as it is some active action taken by the government to change some of their decision for the fiscal policy, so we call this a structural balance. Right. So these two will actually plus together, and they will become what we call the budget balance. Yeah, the budget balance. So under our budget, we're going to take into account of two kind of balance, which is the spending and the revenue that we got from automatic stabilizer, as well as the spending or expenditure that we got from discretionary policy. So then it adds up to our budget balance. Okay, so here we can see that, right, our budget balance versus budget stance, right? Now, basically, we have automatic stabilizer, and that's adds up to the cyclical balance, and discretionary changes, it basically is the structural balance. So which we also call the structural balance as the budget stance, right? We have here the budget stance, right, which is contractionary stance or expansionary stance, we have different stance. And therefore, they add up equal to the total budget that we have, right? Now, as we continue on, if we have a structural deficit, right? So keep in mind that if it's structural, it is basically the contractionary, expansionary, the discretionary, the discretionary policy that we have. And basically, if we have this too, right? If we have structural deficit, basically we means that we have more government spending more than the tax we collected from the discretionary policy. So we call it an expansionary. We have more government spending than the tax revenue. So we have more spending, thus we want to expand the economy, so we call this an expansionary fiscal policy. Now, on the other hand, we have structural surplus, which means that our tax is more than our government spending. So we have a contractionary fiscal policy, right? So the word contractionary and expansionary can only be used for discretionary policy stance. Discretionary policy stance. That's when the government actually take active actions, right? Now, ideally, we want the structural balance to be zero, but that normally happens when the economy is producing at the potential GDP. So when the economy actually operating at the potential GDP, we expect the balance to be zero. The structural balance to be zero, because government will not take any action at all, and they will not actually take into account of that. So then we call it zero, right? But the problem is that it's really impossible for government to do so, right? It's really rare to have. It's really rare to have such a zero, to be there. Always it's a little bit surplus or a little bit deficit, right? Now, so we keep these two together, right? This is structural deficit, and then we have cyclical deficit and cyclical surplus. So that's quite easy, right? So this is the cyclical deficit, right? This is the automatic stabilizers. This is cyclical deficit, and this is the cyclical surplus. Okay. Now, sometimes you actually have a neutral balance stance here. Okay. Now, when I say neutral balance stance, means that government is not taking any discretionary stance action at all. So they will not be doing anything like expansionary or contractionary. So you have a neutral balance stance. When you have a neutral balance stance, your balance is zero. And by that saying, it doesn't mean that here the balance will be zero, because we still have to depend on the cyclical balance. Now, if the cyclical balance is actually negative or a deficit, right, then overall you have a deficit balance here. Okay, so that's the case. So by looking at the budget balance, we cannot say for sure it is always the discretionary that's changing it, but also the automatic stabilizer. Okay, but also the automatic stabilizer. So that's the difference between budget balance and budget stance, right? Sometimes you can have different, you can have expansionary budget stance, but you still get a surplus. That's just because of your cyclical balance is very surplus, right? So it depends on these two balances. So that's basically our learning objective for this video here.